going to cut a slab from a fresh batch of clay. But one good reminder is sometimes these cloths are very smooth, and other times they may have some residue from dry clay on there already. What you want to do is you want to scrape some of that out of the way so you don't get dry pieces in your clay. And this is pretty smooth for me to work on now. I could take a sponge too and actually use that to kind of wet it down a little bit and get so this dust isn't flying around. I'm actually going to go get a sponge right now. Excuse me. You know what, I'm wondering if I should get a paper bowl too. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up this fresh batch of clay. I'm going to show you how to make a slab bowl from it. Now, generally when clay comes like this, it's pretty well wedged and formed. Put my glasses on, so you don't necessarily need to wedge it, and if you're new at wedging, one problem could arise that you end up actually putting more air in than you want. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my wire tool, and about that far. I'm going to go a little bit thicker than I normally would because the top of this is a little inconsistent. If you were to do this on your own, I would say from a piece that's level on the top, I would go about 1/2 inch to 3/4 of an inch, closer to 3/4 of an inch for the slab that you want. This one's a little thicker, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull it towards me and try to make it even. And here's a slab. It's a pretty big slab, but I'll show you to do one that's more level. Again, I would probably about, again, 3/4 of an inch. And I'm checking when I pull it through to make sure it's about the same thickness all the way through. And this is a pretty good size. Go a little bit thinner, but you don't want to go that much thicker, depending on the size of bowl. If we're going to make a bowl about this big, this is a pretty good size to work with. And you can see there aren't any air bubbles here. There's some places where there might have been drier pieces of clay or a little bit of grog that left some lines, but you don't see any gaping holes. I'll keep that covered, and then I'm going to wrap this up. You always want to wrap up the clay so the air doesn't get to it. I'll twist it a little, and actually I'm going to do is I'm going to lay it upside down so it really stays nice and wet. I'm going to take this slab that I rolled out, that I cut, and I'm going to start to work it into something that I could make a bowl with. And this is a technique that works pretty well. Slapping it down, I kind of rotate. Again, you want to do this standing up. Sometimes I'll actually take it with 2 hands, kind of go like this a little bit. This is going to be a nice large size.
What would happen if you would fold it over?
Folding over is a bad thing to do because you can add a lot of air to it. Sometimes in cooking, you like to fold things over or fold things into each other, but not generally with clay. That looks pretty uniform. It's starting to get thin here, so I don't want to do much more of that slapping down technique. At this point, what I'll do is I'll take something like a rolling pin or a dowel rod and start to roll it out to make it more uniform. Thank you. So This is what we use to roll the clay. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to slowly anyone has ever rolled out any cookies or flatbread, or I know most people use a tortilla press, but if you've had any experience cooking or baking, this might be a little easier for you. It reminds me of rolling out pie dough. You don't want to get it too thin.
What's your rule of thumb or rule of pinky?
Okay, right, good point. I don't like to have anything thinner than like the width of my little finger. And the reason why is because it's very likely to break and crack. The clay, that is. Alright, so I'm just kind of stretching it a little bit more. I can see that it's much thicker on this side, so I'll put a little bit more pressure. I don't want to press too hard. I'm doing kind of using this part of my finger, not so much my palm usually, to do this. And if some section of it gets really thin, I may cut that off completely. But again, I want to have a uniform slab, something that's not too thin, something that's flexible enough to put inside a bowl. If I were doing well, actually, we have the balloon there. I don't think this could be. Again, this takes a little bit of practice, but I just make sure when you're starting out not to make it thinner than the width of your pinky. And sometimes it might be hard to see that. So it's not a bad idea to cut a little of the extra edges to see how thick it is. A little bit closer. That's pretty good. It's a little thin here. This is a good width right here. You don't have to use every bit of it. I have a pretty good slab here. And I guess my question is right. Would you want me to do it over the balloon, or should we do it in the bowl?
Do it in the bowl,
Okay.
and then we can do it in the balloon.
So what I'm going to do is I'm going to, again, I want to make sure it's pretty uniform. It's starting to dry out, so I don't want to work with this too much. It's time to get started. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take this paper bowl. We're going to have a lot of leftovers, so there's a lot of other things I can do with this. And then if I really don't need it, what I'll do is I'll wrap it up and I'll put it inside the clay container, preferably inside a plastic bag that's already there. So I'm going to put this down on here. You know what, Mrs. Wright, let me get another, like one of those wooden shish kebab skewers.
Okay.
These a lot. They're little kebab skewers or shish kebab skewers. There's a pointed end, and oftentimes I cut one of the other ends flat. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut out this, a circle that will fit inside this bowl. And I'm going to make it a little bit bigger than the shape of the bowl, because I can always cut away. And so I'm going about 1/2 inch around the circumference of this bowl. I put my clay somewhat in the middle because I figured it was more, I put the bowl in the middle because it's a little bit more uniform there, the same thickness. I can show you. So what I did was I drew a circle on here and I went all the way through. I can take this away. I can use this for other things. A good thing to do would maybe to cover some of it in plastic, take some of the little pieces away. But now I have this here. And I can see it's a little thicker than I thought. So it's not a bad idea if I stretch it out a little bit more. And I can do that by just taking it and rotating it slightly. Now it's a little bit more manageable. You can work with it thick, but not too thick. And for this bowl, what I'm doing is, I don't know, it's maybe a little hard to see, but that's about how thick it is. I'm going to drape it in here. It's not a bad idea to kind of work if I wanted to, I could create an interesting bowl with some kind of curved edges. And in Art Club, we've made some very nice pieces and bowls like that. But if we want to make something that's kind of more straightforward, I'm easing this in. I don't want to press on the bottom. If you do that, you can make the bottom too thin. So I just kind of gently eased it in there. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to trim the sides off. I can decide the shape of my bowl. What I'm doing is I'm kind of, it's a little thin here too, so I might want to be careful. Whatever I do, I don't want to wrap the clay around this edge here.
Why not?
If you do that, the clay will start to shrink and shrink and shrink, and then it will have nowhere to go. And that's where you're going to get a lot of cracking. And you won't be able to take it off very easily. So this is what's called a slump mold. I'm slumping the clay, laying the clay inside the bowl. And again, I don't want to, I want the edges to be able to kind of pop right out. So I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, maybe it would be nice to have a little lip around here. But it looks uneven, right? So what I can do is I can take this tool here. I could also take a fettling knife or a wire tool. Use the wire tool. And
is that a wire tool or a
I'm not a wire tool, I'm sorry, a needle tool, thank you. And take off the excess. Now again, sometimes you can leave that excess on there as long as you don't curl it under. And you can do some nice decorative edges with that, but you do want to smooth out the edges. And so when I'm looking at this, what I want to do is I can, I'm going to trim it all first. Sometimes once the clay gets what's called leather hard, which is still cold, not completely dry, but more firm, you can shape it a little bit more easily. It won't smush as much in your hands. But you could still smooth out some areas. Once the clay is dry to the touch, and not cold anymore, you really can't work with it anymore. You can't attach anything to it. You can paint it, but you can't manipulate it and change its shape or form. Okay, so it wouldn't be a bad idea if I let this sit for 20 minutes, half an hour, even 2 hours, and then come back to it to shape it. But if I don't have a lot of time, I could still shape it now. The thing is, I don't want to pinch. I'm pressing the clay into each other, into itself. And I want my edge to be smooth. I don't want any jagged, sharp edges. You don't want somebody to pick up a bowl that you've made and cut their fingers with it. You want it to be smooth, but not thin. So when I press and when I touch here, I'm putting very little pressure. I'm just kind of smoothing it without pressing down too much. And that's a pretty good, I don't know if you could see this, but it's pretty smooth here. And rounded, rather than sharp and
Flat.
flat, right? So I can continue with this. Okay. So what I'm doing is I'm just kind of smoothing out some of this, but I'm being very delicate with, well, I'm not pressing. Basically, I'm smoothing kind of quickly with my finger, but not pressing, because I don't want it to get any thinner than it already is. And what I did was I made this smooth, and I'm starting to work on the other areas, but I'm noticing that I might need to adjust the form a little bit by cutting some away. And when I cut away, I cut straight down. Again, I don't want to smush it thin. And then I have another little section I can work with, pressing the clay into itself rather than pinching. You really want to avoid the temptation to pinch it, because what's happened with many students is it pinches so thin that it then breaks off. So this is another tool that I use sometimes to just smooth it. And ideally, I might want to let it sit a little longer, so it's not as plastic, it's more leather hard. But this gives you an idea of what you can do during this stage. But again, I'm working slowly, I'm trying to be patient with it. If I notice one area looks a lot bigger or comes out more, I might trim it some more to even it out. But again, I'm trimming it to carefully to keep it from getting too thin. So instead of, like, I wouldn't want to angle that. I'm doing it more like perpendicular to the bowl. So again, it takes a little bit of time. You'll find different ways of kind of manipulating it and experiment with different techniques. Eventually this will be more uniform. I'll let it dry in here. Again, it just takes time. So I've rolled out a slab, well, I kind of flattened a slab from that kind of slap method that I showed you. And so here it is. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a, we had a slump mold. Now I'm going to create a hump mold from using a balloon. And we have a bucket here. I'm going to put this balloon inside the bucket. Maybe it's a little. And using this plate, I'll create a circle. And actually, I have a lot of extra clay, so maybe I'll go a little bigger, and I can always cut away at it later. I can take it off the balloon if I don't like the side. Sometimes it's nice to have things that are a little irregular too with clay. It makes you know, people realize that it is a handmade piece, not machine made. If I'm going to also if you want to stop for a second, Mrs. Wright. Yeah. So when I cut, I want to hold my skewer stick perpendicular, straight up and down. if I angle it, I'm going to get thinner sections.
Which might crack off.
Right. So I'm going to take a minute to just smooth where the plate was. And again, you could cut right along the plate. But since I had extra clay and it seemed thick enough, I am I'm making it a little bit bigger. Okay, so this is my piece.
Would you like me to hold the bucket?
Sometimes you could use somebody to help you, but I think this should be okay.
Great.
What I'm going to do is I'm going to just drape this on here. Hopefully the balloon won't pop. And you could actually leave it so that it has a kind of scalloped, curved edge here. That's kind of a nice thing. I think people like that. I think that's what I'm going to do with this one. And what's going to happen is it's going to dry on this balloon. The balloon will shrink. I'm going around and I'm just smoothing the edges a little bit without making them thin. But again, I might want to wait till it gets a little more leather hard to manipulate it. And then that could be, it's a little off, but I think that'll actually work. You could do it so it's exactly, the balloon was a little bit big for this bucket, but that, you know, it seems to be holding pretty well. So we can just kind of go with this and see what happens. This bowl is going to be a shallow bowl, kind of open, which will be. All right, so this has had a chance to set a little bit. It's not leather hard, but it's not as floppy and as plastic as it was before. And that makes it easier to start to manipulate it. It holds its form better. What I want to do now at this stage is start to kind of pull very, very gently, but pull this away from the edge a little bit more. You can see it's still kind of moving. The nice thing about these plastic paper bowls is they have little creases here, so that gives you a little space to pull it away. I don't know if you can see my fingers, but I'm reaching underneath and kind of pulling this away here. It'll still provide a support for the clay. We won't have it sticking as much, and sometimes there are some issues with it sticking around the rim. If your rim is somewhat flat like this. There are other ways of putting the clay in where the rim can sit up so it doesn't touch this at all. But this is just a good idea to do this and then let it sit out to dry. And it can take a little bit more time here to check to see how smooth it is. The smoother it is on the inside, the more food safe your piece will be. If it's food safe, you can eat anything out of it. But if there are creases and bumps and cracks inside, the problem is bacteria can collect in there. And even if you wash it, it may be harmful to eat from. So you can just kind of check. I'm noticing there's some pockets here that could be smoothed out. And again, I might want to let it dry a little bit more.
About how long?
20 minutes to 2 hours, depending on what the clay is like to begin with and the humidity in the room.
Can I etch anything on the inside, or will that make it unsafe for food?
Okay, so when Mrs. Wright asked, can you etch anything on the inside? Etching would be kind of drawing or scraping on the inside. And you don't want to do that, because if you want it to be food safe. If it's not going to be used for food, sure, yeah, that's fine. We even don't like to etch things on the edges here if you're planning to use it for food. it's better to leave it smooth. Now, later on, when it's more firm, you could take it out and etch on the bottom of the bowl, and that will be all right. But again, if you want to use it for food, please don't do that. If we want to use it for the empty bowls dinner, we can't have it. It has to be smooth on the inside. We can't have any lines or cracks or pockets of spaces. So again, I'm just kind of smoothing this out. I just noticed a little crack here, so I'm going to, I can take a little bit of water. There's just a tiny little crack on the side here. I can use the water to smooth it out. And probably at this point, it might be just a little thin in that spot. I just want to stop. Oh, this was it right here. I might just want to stop messing with. I just stop touching it too much.
What happens if you put too much water on it?
It starts to turn into mud, so you don't want to over-wet it. The other thing you can do is you can use a tool to go back and forth with it. There are going to be things that happen with clay that you can't control sometimes, and maybe not every piece will be one that you will put in the kiln, but you get experience from this, and the next one will be one that you'll have the knowledge that you've experienced and the practice, so future ones could be more successful. I think what I'm going to do is leave it like this. I don't want to overwork it. I could go back to it later, but this is a pretty good form to just let sit now. And there you go.